Hey, so this is my fourth video in my series talking about Star Trek Picard. This time I'm talking about Season 1, Episode 3, The End is the Beginning. An excellent character story with a lot of rewatchability, at least from my perspective. This episode introduces us to Raffi and Rios, moves forward the Soji and Narek story, and then it ends with Picard and the gang setting off on board the La Serena. A word about the title, The End is the Beginning. Star Trek titles are always so interesting. I think this particular title is especially meaningful because at this point in the story, so many threads are coming together that involve people whose lives were effectively over, people who were done living and were just continuing to exist in something less than life. I mentioned back when I discussed Remembrance, episode 1, I discussed that part of the reason I find this theme so compelling is that there's a lot of research, real life research, to the effect that what we often interpret to be old age, this kind of sense of tiredness of being at the end of your life and ready to die, that kind of thing. But it actually ends up being much more psychological and situational in nature. So that while some elderly people report that they've simply been alive too long and it's past time to die, others report that they've never felt more alive in their life. An excellent resource on this topic is Aging Well by George Vaillant, in which he surveys a wide array of case studies in order to isolate what kind of factors actually make the difference between being more alive than ever before at the end of your life, or on the other hand, feeling like Picard put it, that you're just waiting to die. Well, anyway, so this episode, with its very appropriate title, The End is the Beginning. This is when, in this story, all these threads come together and we see a collection of characters meeting together who were all at the complete end of their lives. Picard, Rios, and Raffi were all in the stage of life where you're done. There's nothing left, no reason to live. Everything is over, and you just merely go on existing. Jurati was in a kind of a similar stage, but in a more lightweight manner, since she's no longer able to actively work on her passion projects ever since the synth ban, but she still has an active career of sorts that's not completely unrelated to her passion area. But for Picard and Rios and Raffi, there's really no more life to be had. This was the end for them, or more accurately, this was well past the end. So then what this episode represents is it's kind of like the gathering together of all these tiny little pieces of wax candles that have burned down to a stub and they're ready to be thrown out. Or let's say this gathering together of all these campfires long gone out with no more firewood to start them up again. Or this gathering together of tired eyes slowly shutting. But as the episode gathers together each of these dead little stubs of wax candles long past their end, it's almost like they awake together to find that the end is in fact the beginning, because there are still things worth living for. Life isn't over. There's still meaning to be found. So I just love this choice of episode titles for this particular installment of Picard Season 1. Well, the episode opens with the 14 years ago scene with Raffi and Picard outside Starfleet headquarters. Now, a little bit of a tangent. Usually I don't focus on these kinds of things in most of my videos, but I can't help but comment on the look of the scene. The developer's choice of uniforms for this 14 years ago scene is so perfect. While it's giving an unmistakable nod to the Voyager and the early DS9 uniforms, which so many of us have come to associate with normal Star Trek, they also developed a look that looks like it could be a realistic development from the First Contact uniforms. And then most importantly, they just look good. In fact, this whole scene just looks, well, it just looks right. Now, I do think the nickname JL is really corny. That's definitely true. But all things being equal, the authentic looking environment and the uniforms make this scene so excellent in terms of its incidentals, in terms of, the extra little bits. Of course, the incidentals aren't the primary reason to love it. We don't step into a story for the incidentals, but we step into it for the story. And this particular scene provides a compelling and realistic context for this disillusionment of all our characters, of some of our characters, which is what the rest of the story is all about. So anyway, Picard tells Raffi that Starfleet won't agree to the new plan to help the Romulans, and he finally adds the bit that he offered his resignation and they accepted it. And in describing that meeting, there are two things that Picard says that he never expected. First, he says, "I never dreamed that Starfleet would give in to intolerance and fear." And the second thing he shares just a minute later in regard to his resignation, he says, I never believed they would accept it. And these two things that Picard never expected, they kind of stand out to me as an interesting part of the discussion. The first part there, intolerance and fear. And it makes me wonder, maybe part of what you could say marks the beginning of Star Trek Picard is really this idea of seeing an institution you love give into things that are the opposite of what you thought it ever could. Of course, Starfleet and its admirals and its decisions were never perfect, that's for sure. But Picard seems to suggest that the Starfleet he thought he knew would never give in to this kind of intolerance and fear. Whatever problems Starfleet had, they would never do that. So Picard comes to experience a classic case of disillusionment, just like all the other, of the most important characters in this story at this point. They're all experiencing some kind of disillusionment, realizing that what they thought they knew couldn't happen because of the ideal nature of reality as they saw it. But then it actually happens. And then that second comment he made about the resignation, that takes us to another small theme. He says, I never believed they would accept my resignation. And Rafi says, of course you wouldn't. Kind of reminds you, most likely, reminds me of Admiral Clancy's hubris comment last episode in Maps and Legends. And then just a couple minutes down the road, we're going to get a third similar reference in the next scene where Picard, when he meets with Rafi in the present day at her home in the Vasquez Rocks, and Rafi says he's got a lot of nerve to show up and ask her for a ship and pilot. It's an interesting little set of repetitions that the writers have put in here. But I don't think it's supposed to be telling us that Picard is actually arrogant or full of hubris. He certainly doesn't come across that way. I think it's simply a result of the fact that this is a show about the one and only Picard, who's kind of a fallen star. He's one of the most influential persons in all of Starfleet, who has now lost what he used to have as a result of overplaying his hand back at Starfleet headquarters. And then now in these particular recent moments with Clancy and Rafi, it's kind of like all these years between that incident at Starfleet headquarters, all these years between, he's been so disoriented and lost at sea with his own disillusionment and depression that now when he comes out of it, he doesn't realize the relational mess that he's left with all of his connections that he's left behind him. So, to generalize the psychological principle, this is kind of like, every one of us when we, need to remember to wake up and look around at the people around us, anytime we've been having our faces in the dirt for too long and we haven't been realizing the world goes on. In Rafi's case, she's actually got some resentment that Picard could never have predicted. Her life for the last 14 years has been one long slide into humiliation and rage, she says. And she wishes Picard could have just reached out to say hi. It's not that Picard didn't have relationships. It's just that he neglected certain relationships that were out of sight, or particularly, I think in this case, certain relationships that would have been potentially uncomfortable to maintain. In contrast to people like Laris and Jaban, who probably he kind of unconsciously felt represented to him all the Romulans that he wished he could have saved. While we're talking about Rafi's hovel, as she calls it, I can't help but make a comment on how her little hovel looks so Star Trek. It's not Starfleet, of course, but it gives the vibe that it belongs to the same universe as the various Starfleet quick assemble shelters that they built on various planets during the various series. Just one more subtle way in which Picard Season 1 is so respectful for the visual flavor of traditional Star Trek, particularly 90s Star Trek, in subtle ways that just feel right. Anyway, so next scene, we see Soji and Hugh on the Borg cube. Hugh is impressed with Soji's mindset and her attitude toward the XBs, and agrees to provide a meeting with Ramda. I find Soji's line intriguing, where she explains that her interest in Ramda is an expert in Romulan mythology, and she says that her reason is, quote, there's ample evidence for the therapeutic utility of a shared mythical framework. And so it's such an interesting comment because it reflects a trend in the real life field of psychotherapy toward providing more room for integrating faith and spirituality into psychotherapy when appropriate. because there's so much increasing evidence of the psychological benefits associated with doing that. Soji isn't a therapist, a psychotherapist. She's an anthropologist, and it's not clear exactly what her formal role is in the reclamation project. But whatever it is, apparently she has a pronounced interest in helping the XBs adapt to their new lives. For the XBs, as well as for our other characters, the end may in fact be the beginning. Or at least Soji would like to help them make that to be the case. Next scene takes us back to the Vasquez Rocks. Once again, we see Picard giving perfect responses that show this idealized amount of sensitivity and insight. This is something I mentioned in regard to episode 1, Remembrance. I mentioned this particularly with Picard and his interactions with Daj. It's exactly the same here. He says, "It makes perfect sense that you're angry with me. I disappointed you. I neglected you, and I wasn't there when you needed me. I'm truly sorry." And then he gently moves on to explore aspects of the mission that will appeal to Rafi and her particular interests. And then he specifically emphasizes how much he values the very parts of her personality that often get her rejection or dismissal, specifically her ability to uncover unlikely but important possibilities that others miss. Scenes like this are so satisfying to watch because most television, for good reasons, is full of scenes in which characters remain relatable by continuing to make relational blunders. And while Picard has always been decently likable, at least ever since the later seasons of TNG, it's so satisfying to watch this particular highly sensitive, emotionally intelligent person that he's grown into over the last 14 years. And probably part of it, expands into the range also between Nemesis and that, 14 years ago scene. But wherever it happened, however it happened, is so satisfying to watch the end result. This version of Picard who's so able to relate to others and so able to say and do the right thing, quote unquote, when most people really won't. There is something to say for getting a snapshot of something idealized, even though it's not quite as true to normal life, true to normal people you'll bump into. But it's satisfying to watch. Next bit, at the end of this scene, Raffi mentioned she has a ship, and then we go over to get a glimpse of Jurati being approached by Commodore O about Picard. Then we see Soji and Hugh heading off to visit Ramda, a bunch of tiny little scenes. And then Picard sends Raffi all the info on Maddox. And then, next major scene, then we see the La Serena. And as Picard beams on board, we get this tasteful little bit of classic Trek music. And I have to say, even though it's not a Starfleet ship, it looks a whole lot more Star Trek than a lot of the ships we saw in early season 3. I just finished watching season 3 for the first time, and I have to say I was pretty annoyed for the whole first half of the season, or at least close to half, the full first half. The second half was much more enjoyable. But anyway, coming back to season 1, it's just such a refreshing, rich experience. A lot of my disappointment was kind of the change of the style of storytelling, but also definitely this really abrupt change of the show's aesthetic. But anyway, back to what we're talking about. I really enjoy the scenes that introduce Rios. In fact, this scene introducing Rios, in addition to that earlier scene I just talked about with Raffi, they're actually really, for me, that they're kind of the two iconic scenes that would usually come to my mind back when Picard was newer. These were the scenes that would come to my mind whenever I would think about what Star Trek Picard is. In particular, this scene would pop in my head when I would reflect on just what an absolute expert decision the developers made by choosing to create a show in which Picard would have this low action role, which involves him putting up his feet and having thoughtful discussions with other characters in a psychological and emotionally compelling manner. In my mind, that choice of direction for the show was just an absolutely excellent artistic decision. Can't imagine anything that could have been better. As far as this scene goes, it's just absolutely priceless dialogue as Picard incisively analyzes Rios with his characteristic warmth and sensitivity, while Rios keeps him at arm's length and tries to go back to reading his book on bittersweet existentialism. couple scenes later, we get our first major reveal about what kind of disillusionment Rios experienced when he says he doesn't want another great captain in his life because 10 years on, I still can't close my eyes at night without seeing the last one's blood and brains splattered all over the bulkhead. The writers tell us just enough to understand Rios a little more, but not so much that we think we know his story. And then, of course, as the story develops in future episodes, they continue to do so. They continue to do such an excellent job developing and expositing his character that I think for myself, Rios ends up being, I think, my favorite character in all of season one. There's a lot that I like in season one, but I think Rios actually stands out as my favorite character. Anyway, so story goes on. Picard and Laris and Zhaban are attacked by Romulans, while Soji talks with Ramda about mythology. Ramda says she hates the word mythology and would prefer the term the news. But then Ramda realizes that she remembers Soji from tomorrow. And then as things go on, at the same point where the Romulan in Picard's house calls her the Destroyer, at the same point, Ramda calls her the Destroyer. And then we get the, so as the episode moves toward the end, we have two last significant things that happen right near the end of the episode. We have Soji and Narek in their scene, and then we have Picard and the team launching off with Jurati on board because she managed to convince Picard to bring her on in the last minute. But that scene with Soji and Narek is intriguing. This is when Soji, she's trying to recover from the trauma and the confusion of the moments with Ramda, and Narek comes into her room to check on her. As the conversation develops, she asks him if he believes her. You may remember that Daj asked Picard the same question in episode 1, and Picard gave this perfect answer. But Narek does something entirely different here. In answer to the question, he asks her if she can keep a secret. When she says yes, he delivers the secret. I may be falling in love with you. So he doesn't answer the question at all, nor does he invite her into his confidence, like he seems to imply. Whereas Picard, back in season 1, answered directly and honestly when somebody asked if he believes her, as she's, experiencing all this insanity. Whereas Picard gives us an example of how you can answer directly and honestly, but also sensitively. Narek here answers in a disrespectfully avoidant manner that manages to manipulate her and provide poisonous comfort while letting her know that he refuses to be honest or transparent with her. Like he did in the last episode, he baits her with the idea that he's about to share something secret, but then instead shares nothing of the sort. The difference is that this time she's so desperate for the comfort of feeling like she's special to someone and therefore safe, that in her desperation, she finds this move that he makes that would otherwise be a turnoff or at least a warning sign. She instead finds it to be kind of a powerful binding force that pulls her into his emotional grasp. Fortunately, we don't end the episode on that sour note because we get to see Jurati giving her excited and stumbling speech to Picard to try to convince him to bring her while Rios listens in from his ship through the comm signal. And then we see our crew, pardon my pun, it is kind of a crew now, isn't it? We get to see our crew heading off on the La Serena on a mission, as it were. And then just for fun, Picard can't help but say, engage, just like the old times. Man, I love this episode. Okay, so that's the end is the beginning. To me, this is one of those episodes that you can just watch and rewatch so many times without losing interest because the acting and the character presentation is so rich and compelling. But at the same time, it's also inviting us to think and reflect on the nature of disillusionment and trust, and then particularly what it really means to be at or past the end of what you consider to be your life. For the next video in my series talking about Picard, I'll be discussing Picard Season 1, Episode 4, Absolute Candor. See you then.